Welcome to the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Dame, holistic nutrition coach and speaker. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode here on the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm so excited to introduce to you and welcome our guest today, Dr. Nasha Winters. Hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, Danny. Thank you so much for having me here.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you. We were just chit-chatting before hitting record here. We have some mutual friends, and it's been long overdue to have you on the show and to really dive into a big conversation with the C word, right? And the link with sugar. And, this is obviously, we talk about all things holistic here, not just sugar, but this is such a topic that I'm curious to know more about, and I am definitely not an expert in, which is why I wanted to bring you in, and it's something that we often hear, right? So we're going to get into some of that today. But before we get started, Nasha, I would love for people who aren't familiar with you or your work, if you could share a little bit, as far back as you want to go, of your story. I know you have quite a powerful story, and then we can go from there and dive deeper.
Well, I think probably you're used to having people on here that didn't just say, gosh, I think I'm going to wake up and just be mindful of my sugar intake. Or like in my world, I don't think people wake up and say, I think it's going to be really fun to work with cancer. I mean, that's just not something that happens unless you have your own sort of awakening, your own experience with it. And so I'm no different than anybody else you have on here that, gosh, it'll be 32 years in October of 2023 that I was given the "you have cancer" talk. And unfortunately, I was so far gone. It had been missed over and over because you weren't looking for the zebra in a 19-year-old of end-stage ovarian cancer, which is unfortunately what I had going on. And instead, it looked very much like all of the other health conditions that I'd had my entire pre-menstrual and menstrual life to that date, from endometriosis to polycystic ovarian disease to irritable bowel syndrome to cystic acne to the beginnings of early rheumatoid arthritis, later on to find out I also had Hashimoto's and celiac disease. I had like a lovely collection of things all before the age of 20, and cancer decided this is a really great garden to plant myself in, so why not, right? But because I'd had so many symptoms that carried, or conditions that carried so many symptoms of what ovarian cancer expresses as, it was missed and it was missed and it was missed until it was too late. And honestly, my organs had shut down. I had a bowel blockage, kidney, liver shut down entirely, severely malnourished, cachectics. We might talk about that today with regards to sugar as well. And so that was what landed in my lap, and they were afraid to even give me a single dose of chemo for fear it would just kill me outright. Ironically, they said with treatment or without treatment, you're looking at about 3 months. And the irony of that is now, as a doctor looking back, I likely had a lot less time than that because of the condition of my body and honestly my psyche at the time. So fast forward 3 decades later, I did not expect to live. I did not expect to go seeking treatments, even when nothing was offered from standard of care. I just wanted to understand why a 19, almost 20-year-old would have this diagnosis and why no one was as weirded out by that as I was. And so I'm still one of the few people weirded out by that, apparently, which is really strange. And even unfortunately in the last, year and a half, 2 years, I have seen multiple young girls under the age of 10 with stage 4 ovarian cancer, which just sounds the alarm for me, makes me passionate about all things oncology, all things metabolic, which then feeds into your community, all things related to what we're eating. And so I am glad to be here to tell a little bit more of how all these pieces weave together.
Wow. Oh my goodness. I know you're sharing obviously just the really quick bit of that story, but that is just insane what you went through, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
The question that comes first to mind, and obviously my audience would be thinking as well, is like, how did you do it? Yeah. How did you live, right? What did you do? What did you learn? I mean, obviously that's a huge question, but what do you attribute your survival and your thrival? We'll make up that word as well.
I appreciate that word. Thank you. I actually do see myself as a thriver, not a survivor, because thriving is also like surviving seems like you're done with something. We're never done with this, right? I'm forever changed by the process, but I also have to be on hypervigilance because of certain genetic constituents, certain environmental exposures and sensitivities that I have in my epigenetics, things like that, that makes me have to be a little bit different in what how I have to live on this planet today. So I consider myself a thriver. I thrive with this diagnosis. I would likely not even be considered free of this diagnosis because I'm still continuing to support this whole system of mine that happens to have found really beautiful synergy and peace with having cancer in my body. And so the first step, and we're going to touch on this today, kind of the three big S's. A lot of people think it's just about the sugar that's driving the metabolic changes in our body, but I had all three of the S's, which are sugar, sex, being sex hormone issues, and stress. And so for me, a couple of the pieces that was sort of one of my accidental fixes, which I would not understand until many years later, because this goes completely into the face of what's recommended, was I had a bowel obstruction, as I mentioned, to the point where the thought of food, the smell of food, the taste of food, or the ingestion of food made me violently ill and writhing in pain. So I literally had nothing solid for 2 months. And what little bits of fluids I could take in was water and a few different herbal teas, and then later on some broths. And so that bowel obstruction naturally went away by itself. I did not have to have surgery. That's actually one of the best strategies for a bowel obstruction is bowel rest, which is what I gave it over 2 months. So that was my number one accidental. And what I didn't know, which we now know now, is the sheer avoidance of those foods for that period of time. I would also do the caveat to your audience that please do this under medical guidance, because naivete was on my side apparently at that time, and a lot of blessings and luck and support around me. But one of the things that happened is it drastically lowered my inflammation. Number one. Number two, it drastically changed my metabolic programming. So it down-regulated a lot of signaling pathways that were feeding into my cancer process. Number three, it also took out a lot of the endocrine disruptors that I was ingesting on a regular basis. So I was definitely like living on the fast food latchkey kid, living on fast food. I worked at a hot dog on a stick, for crying out loud, for 6 years of my life. I was still living on like ramen noodles and stuff as a starving college student. I was just, everything was highly, highly processed, highly, highly drenched in things like glyphosate, highly plasticized, you name it. I was living in the water bottles, the BPA drenched water bottles. I was working in retail where I was handling all those receipts on a regular basis. So I was messing with my endocrine system pretty regularly, as already having a lot of issues. So that took away a lot of those exposures. And the other thing, which I don't go into the details on because it's always just awkward in a discussion like this, but I went on a family fast. The stress in my life was pretty exorbitant from my family of origin, a lot of toxicity. In fact, if your listeners aren't familiar with what's known as the ACE score, it's a scientifically validated questionnaire asking questions about what type of exposures you had in trauma space before the age of 18. And on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 of these questions, I was a 10 of 10. And so what that tells us in the literature is that I was already destined with that trauma history to have some severe form of chronic illness at a very young age, and it definitely increased my risk of cancer. So somehow knowing to step away from that was very, very helpful. I was also working grave shifts. So imagine what was happening with my circadian rhythm, my hormones, my metabolic health, and my stress response, all of that, my world literally inside out, upside down. And I was taking 28 hours of pre-med. So I was a dual major of biology and biochemistry. So I wasn't taking like underwater basket weaving courses. I was in the hardcore sciences, very rigorous, a lot of competition, really driven. That was part of my survival mechanism of what I came through, was just to be incredibly driven. So the 3 S's were very much alive and well in my system. And even if I'd just dealt with any one of them, the others were so relevant and prevalent that they were pushing me back into a state of imbalance. So even if I was perfect with my diet, the stress and those hormonal disruptors were still well on board. Or if I did just get away from my family but keep eating hot dog on a stick, that would have been a problem. Or if I continued to expose myself to a lot of the endocrine disruptors out there, that would have been a problem. So it's a big, long-winded story, but it's helping already start to, I hope, elucidate that there's a lot more than just a single cause, and therefore not a single treatment for any of these conditions. But it's definitely gotten me curious over these 3 decades as to why we get cancer and perhaps looking at it through a different lens.
Yeah. Wow. So many things that I would love to dive into there. But I really, really want to appreciate these sort of trauma and psychological pieces that you mentioned, that's an area that I'm extremely passionate about myself, doing a lot of somatic therapy and a lot of psychedelic therapy and a lot of pieces around like what's actually happening in our nervous system in terms of manifesting in our bodies and in our cellular structure and the development of turning on and off of genes and all this stuff is really fascinating, right? Understanding now the physical aspects that show up with the emotions and the trauma and the stuff that we've stored that inside. So I really, I really want to commend you for that. I know that that's really hard to face that fact. And I know a lot of my listeners might be having this, right? Whether it's family or loved ones or relationships that just aren't serving. And we realize that, maybe if we're stuck in a trauma pattern or we're stuck in these stressful, people might just see that, the box is called stress, right? Which is so many different layers below it. But the stress, right, of where we're living, what we're going through, where we're working, how we're being treated, all these things really, creating a perfect environment for disease, right? And the perfect storm for you. And I'm, also really appreciate that you mentioned it's all three, right? I think a lot of my listeners, and I see this a lot in like the nutrition space, is right, people are focusing so much on just the nutrition, right? And I see this in the sugar space. People are just focused on detoxing from sugar, right? They've got this clean diet, whether they're going hardcore carnivore or keto or just going off of sugar. And why are their problems not solved? Why am I not losing weight? Like why? So there's so much more to the puzzle. And that's where I've become really fascinated with the emotional, mental, spiritual pieces of it. But I appreciate you mentioning all three of those, right? Needing to be looked at. And I'm curious then, coming back to your story, when you were given those few months to live, was it all accidental? Did you throw yourself into starting to research? Like, how did you, obviously you were listening to your body and not eating, doing those fasts so your body could actually heal itself. But what other tools did you use to actually support you in understanding this? You obviously understand all these things that were at play now, but you didn't back then, right?
Exactly. Especially in 1991, you guys, there was no Dr. Google. There was microfiche and Dewey Decimal System, right? And that was our research. That was it. And the crazy part is because I was the first person in my family to go to college. It was also the only person in my family to go to college. It was also, I had to do a lot of work study. I had to do a lot of Pell Grants. I had to go there on a lot of student loans, just to even go and break generational, patterns of that. So one of my work study jobs was in the library. And that was actually one of the best things ever, because I had I just spent hours milling through everything I could find. And, back in 1991, not a heck of a lot of information. We were still churning out the somatic mutation theory. Actually, we still are today, which is the gene theory of cancer and this two-hit concept of cancer, which just didn't really resonate with me. But I unfortunately or fortunately stumbled upon, I think it's very fortuitous, is that I stumbled upon the work of Dr. Otto Warburg of the 1920s, who talked about another theory of cancer, which back in 1991 was so deeply underground. Like no one knew about this, talked about this, right? It kind of got dusted off and brought back into our face about in 2011 or so. But in 1991, not the case. It would be 20 more years before that was the case. But that resonated with me so much more, where this researcher thought that perhaps our problems are starting more at the mitochondrial metabolic level, which is the protector and the precursor to what would happen at that genetic level. And so that resonated with me so much more. So even though I was accidentally in a fasted state because of a pain and a bowel blockage, that was clearly already making metabolic shifts in me. And I was starting to recognize that. I was also starting to recognize the anti-inflammatory aspects of the changes in my diet and my lifestyle pretty early on. I was pre-med, so I had a bit of a brain. I was in all the courses in anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, organic, all the things. So all of those things made sense to my scientific brain. And I was hell-bent on going on to conventional medical school. But honestly, when I would go to the conventional medical doctors, they did not know what to do with me. I was still too sick. My organs still not functioning well enough to even be offered any treatment. So I was left to my own devices. And so in that first few weeks, it was very scary. It was very alone, and I kept it very, very private. In fact, I kept it pretty private until about 2012. We could go into a whole podcast about that. But it was something that there was just a small handful of people in my inner circle that had any idea what was going on. And probably none of them even understood how bad it was, because I'm pretty sure they would have pushed hard against me to choose a different route, even though there were honestly nothing offered to me. So this isn't to say go and not do standard of care. Standard of care just was not an option at that time. So that, running across Otto Warburg's understanding cancer as a metabolic mitochondrial disease, understanding the trauma piece, I actually stopped doing my chemistry major and switched over to a psychology major with a biology minor, and basically created a self-constructed major of psychoneuroimmunology, which was way ahead of its time. The work of Robert Ader, the work of Candace Pert, the work of Bruce Lipton, which I get to meet in person in a couple weeks at a big conference that I'm like, dude, he has no idea how he influenced my life. So I'm very excited about that. And also the very first book that I found in the library after being told you're screwed, basically, was this crazy Indian guy by the name of Deepak Chopra.
What a weird name.
Yeah, Quantum Healing. I sat down on the library floor and read that book in about 2 hours. And it was a quantum healing for me. It made me realize that there was so much more than meets the eye. And it really put me on this pace. And you also made mention of a piece of psychedelics, which, thank you, Michael Pollan, that allows me to share this now, to come out of the closet a little bit. But I was a little bit, what's the word? I was a little bit like, I'm going, so I'm going to go out hard.
Yes.
So the good girl, always the good girl in my history, always the good girl. Mm-hmm. I decided I was just going to try all the drugs and do all the things. And I ended up with an accidental heroic dose of psilocybin. Pretty sure. And that was all within 2 weeks of this diagnosis. And
okay. So, how does that accidentally happen?
Because I was stupid enough that they're like, here, have some mushrooms. I thought when they handed me the baggie, I was supposed to eat all of them.
Okay.
They were all focused elsewhere doing other things. So by the time they turned around to apparently get their own dose, we guesstimate today probably 10 to 11 grams.
Wow.
And so I went through a death process and a rebirth process. But I will also tell you and your listeners, I can't believe we're going on this topic on sugar.
I love it.
I did not want to live prior to my diagnosis, and was even on the fence about it prior to my heroic dose. And what you'll see today in the literature and the studies, and I've sent many patients to Harvard for the studies of this, by the way, that were in-stage cancer patients facing their mortality to do medicalized, supervised doses of psilocybin. It was definitely something that showed me a different way. It showed me another offering, another opportunity, another perspective. So I'm pretty certain that fed into my will to live, lit the pilot light as much as the being told there's nothing you can do about this, you're just going to die. That also turned on my stubborn genes. Yeah. In a really powerful way. It also really jumped into my OCD genes, which I really fully embraced, threw me into the realm of research. I definitely love research. My scientific mind is just as strong as my, what I call my woo-woo mind at this point in time. My scientific was always running the show, but after some life experiences, I think they're kind of neck and neck now. But those were the things that led me to this. I also was blessed enough to meet and work with an acupuncturist who really helped me with a lot of my pain patterns, really resolve my digestive issues, really helped me regulate my cycles. So many things that just accidentally came together. And that's where I also in my library time learned about naturopathic medicine. Mm-hmm. I was really on track to go to Baylor Medical School. And that reading in the back of this book about this little unknown profession called naturopathy, I went on a road trip the summer of 1992, while I was still alive, already now a good 6-8 months past my diagnosis, still sick, still very, very sick, but knowing that there was something else for me, I just wanted to go on a road trip. I was kind of doing all my bucket list things. And that's how I learned about naturopathy. So these pieces, I feel like everything I've learned is like kicking the can down the road and learning something new and applying it, and learning something new and applying it, and then having tens of thousands of patients that I could apply this with. But to your point that was taking this whole long-winded piece here is I recognize there was no one thing. And what standard of care is constantly focused on is the one problem with the one target and the one treatment. And we can fall into that seductive hole just as much in the low-carb, metabolic community, integrative oncology community, psychedelic community, you name it. If you are like, you can't outrun a shitty diet, there's that. You can't psychedelic yourself out of trauma. You have to still do the work and integrate it. You can't, you can't just like take a pill to change your hormones or, a prescription to change your hormones, because you will pay the price for that as well. It just helps you start to realize you have to look deeper of what is pulling the levers behind the magic curtain,
Yeah, that's such a great way of putting it. And thank you for sharing all of that. This topic so excites me, especially when
good. Okay. I was like, I know we went way off tangent here, Danny. So
very safe things. Okay. And I really appreciate you, because I know that it's a tricky area to sort of come out of the closet in, right? And I just came out a couple months ago on the podcast myself with the work that I've been doing. Thank you. Yes, welcome to the crew. Wow. And I really appreciate you sharing that piece, because I'm actually curious, have you ever seen Dosed? Have you seen the documentary Dosed? Yeah. So similar to what Lori was going in the documentaries that were, co-produced by Dr. Gabor Mate and a whole bunch of really big thought leaders. Highly recommend looking it up. There's 2 documentaries. The second one follows that lady who has end-stage cancer and is supported with psilocybin to see the bigger picture and to deal with the anxiety. And that really... Ultimately, like on a physical level, what I got from that, and you'll have obviously more research on this, right, is the lowering of the stress in your body when you realize that you're okay, right, and everything's going to be okay, and everything is one, and like having these whatever experience you have, right, it kind of speaks to that, like I'm okay, it's all going to be okay, and our system then, our nervous system can chill out a bit, right, and relax, right, and the inflammation and the stress levels going down. From that on a physical level, really obviously playing a role. That's really cool that you, good thing you accidentally,
a lot of things, accidentally, a lot of things is what I tell people. But like some of our most amazing medical breakthroughs are from accidents.
Well, that's how LSD was discovered too.
Penicillin. I mean, like some of these crazy things. It's like we still don't even understand the mechanism of action of aspirin, and yet it's one of the most utilized therapy. Like just all the things, right? So whenever we think we know, we actually know very little, and that is why there's always a little bit of room for me in my scientific analytic mind. There's always a little bit of room for just magic and awe.
Yes.
And so that is also, that curiosity is what helps us also keep being accountable to our own process and continue to explore and be curious and keep uncovering whatever needs to be dealt with. And, sugar is so much about also, like, you get cravings when your hormones are out of balance, when your sleep is off, when you're under stress. So if you're not tending those, you're going to constantly be battling yourself for those cravings that are just an alarm telling you what else have you not dealt with that keeps these cravings in your forefront.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you're speaking to the choir here, which is so amazing. And I love this. So can you explain a little bit more to my audience, this concept of obviously metabolism, metabolic health, and what that really has to do with cancer development? Like what have you learned, in this approach, and obviously your study over the last 3 decades with, the link there between metabolic health and cancer development?
Perfect. Well, trying to think of keeping this pretty simple here. So one of the things most people, when they think metabolism, they think about your caloric burn rate and, your weight management perhaps. And so they're like, oh, I have a slow metabolism or a fast metabolism. That is like one tiny sliver of what I mean when I say metabolic. But that is a component, right? The other component, what standard of care defines as metabolic health, are a few factors. So one of them is, which is ironic because none of these are related to that caloric intake except for one, which is the waist to hip ratio, meaning your waist should be skinnier than your hips, men and women, right? You should not have the Dunlap, that whole Dunlap over your belt. So that's number one. Number two, they talk about the importance of having a normal blood pressure. 120/80 is their idea of normal, but really we all have a little bit of variability. You could probably go as low as 110/70 and as high as 140/90 to be in that zone, but any too high or too low is problematic. So that's another one. The other one is, of course, regulated blood sugar. Now, sugars today, our glucose today is based on the average of the population. It's also very transient and dynamic, and it's based on the region in which you live. So for instance, they would say that in Alabama, your blood sugar is still normal if it's at up to 120, where in Colorado, they would say maybe upwards of 95 or 100. So even the regions of the country, they're basing it on what they're seeing on average into the lab data that they're collecting. That's not helpful, right?
Wow.
And then I know, right? And then looking at things like your lipids. So what we all tend to think of lipids are cholesterol levels. Everyone's hyper focused on cholesterol and on and on LDL, but really we need to be focused on triglycerides. And the crazy thing is, I don't understand how we are still blasting this bullshit, that triglycerides are all about eating fat, right? I'm like, it's about eating sugar that gets stored into fat, or eating sugar with really crappy fat, both high fat and high sugar diets that get stored as fat. That is what it's a marker of.
Yeah. That's really important. What you just said, I want to pause you because many of my listeners, myself included not long ago, right, still had that idea and that mentality, right? We're still living with the fat is bad. If I eat more fat, I'm going to have bad cholesterol and then I'm going to have a heart attack, right? So can you speak a little bit more to that, or just repeat yourself? Because I feel like that is a very important part. I know Dr. Robert Lustig has done a lot of work on this in his book Metabolical, talking about, what's really going on and rewiring essentially the lies that we've been told around, fat leading into this, when really it's the sugar and the seed oils, right?
Yes, I love it. Exactly. And so that's, just to give a context, when I started medical school in 1996, the cutoff for overall cholesterol was 399. The cutoff for LDL was 399. The cutoff for overall triglycerides was 300. We didn't have HDL. We didn't have very low density lipoproteins. We didn't have those factors. The same year I started med school was the first year they put statins on the market. And we started to lower the number, not based on health, but based on selling of a drug. And my husband worked for Merck and sold these drugs for a very long time. So it's not a conspiracy theory, it's a freaking reality, and it's a really hard one and harsh one, because even with us lowering that overall cholesterol number and trying to obtain this sort of mythical unicorn with a statin drug to lower this, we have not changed our cardiovascular outcomes one iota. So there's that. Number two, what we have done, and we are very clear on, is what it's depleting in us. It's depleting, statins are depleting our ubiquinol, sorry, I got a little hair flying away here, ubiquinol or CoQ10, which is a major component of how our mitochondrial metabolic processes function, right? So if you're taking that away, you're just lending yourself to more vulnerability in your mitochondria and in your metabolic levels. It also breaks down muscle mass, so it leads to sarcopenia, and it also breaks down fat in your brain, okay? We need our brains, folks. It's all fat. And so there's levels of dementia that's seen with this. There's levels of rhabdomyolysis, which is a breakdown of your muscles. There's definitely lowering of ubiquinone, rising of homocysteines, because it also lowers B12. These agents, they take out all of your B vitamins. They also deplete your fat-soluble nutrients. And so they lead to a whole cascade of issues, of which none of them all of them are contributing to the metabolic mayhem that we all experience today. So that's super important to know. And so we have done just that. We've looked at blaming the fat where the sugar's the problem, or blaming the wrong kind of fats. There are definitely problematic fats, and I want to really reiterate that. The linoleic acid, for instance, is a really bad one. The seed oils, the corn oils, all of those in particular. And that is what is pretty much endemic in all of our food sources, especially if you go out to eat, even good restaurants. If you eat any processed foods, it's all loaded with that, which just aggravates insult to injury. So the interesting thing is the triglycerides and our AST levels, which is a liver marker, a liver enzyme marker, and our basic blood count that you could go and spend $12 to get this test done. Those will tell you that you're already probably dealing with fatty liver, which they say is plaguing upwards of 90% of our population globally. Yeah. So this is thanks to not the good fat. This is not the bacon and eggs your grandparents ate that's causing the problems. This is post-World War II Crisco's and trans fats and bringing up sugar as we pulled fats out of food. So that's where we are there, and we've really created a nightmare. In fact, I got to hear and hang out with Dr. Lustig in London just a couple weeks ago. He was a keynote at an integrated personalized medicine conference. There were 2,200 people there, and they're all still scratching their heads about this fat piece. So I love that he spoke to that, as also the issues around fructose, as well as the issues around linoleic acid and the inflammatory seed oils. So these are the smoking guns that we all seem to be told not to look at. We are still being told that it's all about, your cholesterol's now 206. We got to get you on a statin. Let me just tell you, in the world of cancer, when I see someone's overall cholesterol tanking below 170, I start looking for cancer. That's an ominous sign.
Yeah.
What happens, oftentimes you'll see those patients, the lower their overall cholesterol goes, the higher their triglycerides go. And we are telling people that it's normal to have a triglyceride of, high hundreds, low 200s. We're still calling that normal. But if a patient has triglycerides over 90, they already have fatty liver. So these are the pieces. If your AST is already over 25, you already have early signs of fatty liver. And these are signs and symptoms of metabolic fragility, metabolic brokenness. So coming back to what the Western defines metabolic health, hip to waist, blood pressure, blood sugar. Now they still think blood sugar is fine at 100 or 120. I want it under 85. That's my top number. And really, they're not even looking at the real number you need to be looking at, which is insulin. Right? The real issue is that we all have problems with our insulin. So that number should be in a healthy person under 5 and a cancering person likely under 3. That freaks people out to be looking at this. And in hemoglobin A1C, that average of your glycosylated end products exposures of sugar over 3 months, that number should be under 5. And we're calling pre-diabetic 5.6 and we're calling diabetic 6. There is no such thing as pre-diabetic, folks. It's like being sort of pregnant.
Right?
There's no buffer here. It's like you're either on the highway to hell into that zone, or you are turning the car around on the highway as quickly as possible with your own input. It will not resolve on its own. You have to do something about it.
Yeah.
And so to round that out of what is, and the other thing about defining a metabolic health is your stamina and your energy level. So what the studies show, we had the first study come out in 2018. It was a Chapel Hill, North Carolina study showing that only 12% of Americans, and you can extrapolate this to all globalized countries, 12% were considered metabolically healthy. That was in 2018. Another study came out in July 2022 showing that less than 6.8% of us are metabolically healthy. So we actually cut ourselves down half after COVID, which was not a surprise, just given everything, but we are in trouble. So that means that more than 93% of us are metabolically broken, and why this podcast and these conversations are critical to literally keeping you from seeing somebody like me for cancer, or one of my colleagues for metabolic psychiatry, or cardiovascular disease, or diabetes, or obesity, or autoimmune conditions, or any of these conditions that are considered metabolic in nature. And so when the body decides to prioritize other food sources, it changes the ability to take in information, light, water, sound, food, all the things, people. It causes problems with that, and then it bungles up the messaging of what is signaled back out into the body. And so ultimately, we are our beautiful mitochondria, which are these beautiful antennae that take in all of the information. They depend on us to nourish them. And that's not just with food and water, but that's also with light and with a sound and light frequency and vibration, but also people, thoughts, energies. Those all impact the expression of our mitochondria. And when you are taking in sources of nourishment that don't best serve your mitochondria don't work as well. They become less in number, they become less efficient, they become deranged, and they can metabolically then shift into preferring to take on sugar as their primary fuel source to feed cancer versus being kind of the adaptable dual hybrid engine that they were designed to be.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so much there. Thank you for sharing all of that, though. That's great. Everybody who's listening to this, pause, rewind, listen to that again. Really, really important information, and I'm so grateful for you sharing, all of that. You mentioned something just at the end there that was a question I wanted to ask, like point blank. Does sugar cause cancer? Like, this is the question for everybody. We've heard it, yes. We've heard it, no. So, what is your opinion on that? Is it causing cancer, or is it perpetuating cancer, or what do you see?
Well, I see it as not necessarily a cause, but it contributes to the vulnerability of cancer expressing in your body. Right. It will definitely perpetuate cancer once cancer is on board. That is pretty clear. We can see that in our lab testing. We can see that in our PET scan, our PET imaging. Whether or not it actually is the light, like the match to light the fire, there's still controversy in whether that's the case. But there's definitely certain propensities within us. So some of us have epigenetics that make us much more vulnerable to being in a metabolically fragile state. So a much higher incidence of, say, diabetes. So things like the ACSL1 SNP, or the APOE SNPs, or the ACAT SNPs. Like, there's a lot of different SNPs that sort of set you up. The ADIPOQ SNP, for instance, these set you up to basically have diabetes. Like, it's just like when you say, yeah, my grandpa, my dad, and my uncle, they all had it. Well, we just think, oh, I'm just going to have it too. But remember that we have the ability to go above our genes. So we can change that expression. We might have the propensity, but we can do something about it to silence their expression. So a lot of people who have those patterns do have a tendency to turn sugar into something problematic for them in a lot of chronic illness in the future, including cancer. But there's other buckets. We talk about the drops in the mitochondrial bucket. I talk about this in my book, The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. We talk about the epigenetic bucket. So that's the generational things that were passed downstream that, yeah, you might have been born with that, but you can play your deck of cards very differently than your ancestors did. So there's that one. The metabolic, which is literally what are you fueling your body with? So that one is just another drop in the bucket. It's not the whole bucket. Then we talk about the toxicants. Literally all of us are exposed today. No one is without toxic exposures. That really messes with your expression of your genetics, but also the expression of your metabolic health. Then we talk about your microbiome. This is something that I can't believe we're just now finally agreeing in Western medicine that this is a thing. They've been saying this for 2,000 plus years. So Hippocrates is like, all disease starts in the gut. So the microbiome is also very critical to the balance of our immune function, but also the balance of our metabolic and our food cravings, things like that. Then we get to the immune system. We mentioned earlier before we got on about vitamin D. Vitamin D pretty much pulls the levers of all 10 drops in the bucket. It's really helpful in the immune system, is where we often think about it, but it's very important in metabolic health and hormonal health and microbiome health as well. And then inflammation we've alluded to, angiogenesis and oxygenation. So how are you moving oxygen throughout your body? That's why movement is so key, And then we get into hormone balance, which we've already alluded to as well. Stress response we've alluded to. And the final big one is mental, emotional care. So these 10 drops contribute to this, and each of us have a different threshold. We all have a unique bucket, and we all have a different threshold. And so what I help clients do, and I help doctors learn to do with their patients, is to evaluate what's in that bucket, to know what your priorities are. They very well may be sugar is the main driver for you, but they could also very well be, like for me, I think at that time it was sugar, stress, and emotional trauma. I think those were my three drivers at the time. And those are the three that I still have to work at the hardest.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. Thank you for explaining all 10 of those, because I think we so easily get stuck in that mind of it's one thing, right? And that's how we've been taught. Yeah. And, why is this one thing not fixing it all? And it can be really overwhelming. So I love that you're helping guide people into like, what are your, top 3 or top 1 areas,
exactly,
right? That need focused, right? Yeah. And because if we start focusing on all 10, which we all probably need work on all of those.
Exactly.
I know I do. Like I'm still working on all those areas, right? I'm not at all perfect in there. I'm a human. But what are the areas that are going to move the needle the most or have the biggest impact, right? Like what are you eating McDonald's 3 meals a day? Maybe that's like a good place to start, right? And maybe not. So yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. Also with the epigenetics, I remember way back when I started getting curious about holistic health and started doing my nutrition coaching certificate, was started understanding that myself. And that was actually a huge motivator for me wanting to get healthy and change my life, because both my patriarchal and matrilineal sides of my family are riddled with all the diseases. Cancer, diabetes. I never met my grandpa. He died of a heart attack before I was born. Like just everything, all obese. All like very unwell.
Metabolic.
Totally. Yeah. And I started learning like, wow, I don't want that. Like, I don't want that to be my future. And starting to actually take back like responsibility, right? I think there's so much, like that's what you're mentioning here, is owning that we actually have a lot more control than we think we do. And most people, including my family still, love you all if you're listening to this, but I see you doing this, right, is just blaming circumstances, right? Blaming, well, it's in our genetics. I'm going to get diabetes. Oh, it's just because I'm getting old. That's a huge common one, right? Oh, I'm going to get osteoporosis, or I'm going to have diabetes, or I'm going to have all these problems because I'm old, right?
You brought up such a beautiful point with the old piece. First, I love this because people are spending a fortune on longevity medicine and going and doing all the rejuvenation and the anti-aging medicine. And you can throw that crap at it. You can throw every hormone, every pill, potion, light therapy, you name it, at the body. The only thing that's in charge of the way we age, because we have our biological age and our chronological age. And they do not have to be on the same place. You could be much older in a young body or much younger in an old body, because that is what we do have control over. And so longevity, you guys, is 100% based and rooted in the health and wealth of your mitochondria. And so when someone's like, oh, it's because I'm getting old, we'll say, then apparently your mitochondria are getting old and you can do something about it to change your biological age. Yeah. And there are tests. You can actually literally send a test out today to get your biological age tested. And then you have a little kind of gamification of it so that you can come back around and show yourself that there's even like great online questionnaires that are pretty good. And then you can get a blood test to actually confirm it, to know. But like, I'll be 52 in a couple weeks, in the end of September. At 52, my biological age is healthier than it was at 19 at the time of my diagnosis. And I promise you, because I check my labs very regularly, my biological age right now in the last test I did was 37 years old. And so that is pretty cool to me, that we can actually change the way we age, and we can throw away the labels, and we can focus in to understand that this is a mitochondrial metabolic disorder that we have complete control over. And that becomes really fun and exciting to me, not overwhelming and daunting. And when I look at my own family of origin, it breaks my heart of looking at, I'm the oldest cousin. And if they're listening to this, they'll probably be very upset with me, but I don't think any of them that would deny that, like, people usually think I'm the youngest cousin, right? Or the youngest in the setup. My nieces and nephews will tell, they always say to my husband and I, why do you guys seem healthier than us? It's like, because we work at it. We understand this. So there is something we can do about it. So I really love that you brought up this piece of just aging or longevity, because it is all under the control of our mitochondrial function.
Yes. Thank you for interjecting and adding that. That feels really important. And, you know, anybody listening, you know, there's no guilt or shame here about the victimizing. This is how we've been taught to think. And usually our social circles, I see this with my clients and with my family, right? The social circle is talking like that, right? Yeah. Like, oh, we're disempowered. We have no control over our genes, right? We have no control. We're just going to get sick and die. That's the norm, right? Again, trusting the normal in a society that is sick, very sick, is not necessarily a good benchmark, right? Yeah. Same with the numbers like you were talking about. And that's really important. And the sad truth, and I know you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think it's important for everybody to notice, right? Like why this isn't common knowledge, like what you're sharing here, is because when we all realize this, nobody makes any money. Right? And like, think of the anti-aging billion-trillion-dollar industry to help you age backwards, right? With skin creams and
Yeah.
laser surgeries and
Yeah.
all the stuff, right?
Yeah.
Let alone avoid disease, right? There's no
Right.
money in healthy people. And
Right.
it is just a sad truth of the world that we live in. And I'm sure you see that a lot. You have sort of an inside scoop in it. And
Yeah.
I think it's important for people to understand so that we can start to take our power back and know that we don't have to subscribe to that way of being and that model. And we actually have a lot more control and we can step by step. I mean, that's really what this podcast is about, is taking your power back, right? Finding your voice and knowing that your body can actually heal itself when you provide it this low inflammation, healthy environment to do the work that it knows how to do.
Exactly. Divinely created to do, which is just so blows my mind of that, you know, we're really just getting in our own way, you know, and all the things we've done to make our lives better. I mean, a lot of this changed like post World War II, right? We you know, first of all, during World War II, we took women out of the home and into the workforce because we had to support our soldiers abroad. There were so many reasons of how and why we did the things we did. We started to subsidize our farmers so that they could stop growing the foods they'd always grown to start to grow things that were being kept from us from the Cold War. So suddenly we weren't getting access to the Russian wheat and all those things. So we had to start to subsidize people to stop growing what you've always grown and start to grow these things. Well, these things have led to a lot of changes, getting us away from home-cooked meals, getting us into the era of TV dinners, getting us into the era of monocropping our planet. Also, all that leftover ammo, what are we going to do with it? I've got an idea. Let's turn this into our big ag and our big pharma. So it became the base camp of a lot of our pharmaceuticals, especially in the cancer world. And so post-World War, you know, the other things that changed after World War II is we put all of that nitrogen, all those leftover ammos into our big ag, which is now monocropped us, which is also then monocropped our microbiome. And it's the loss of that diversity which also takes away our immune function, our metabolic function, our psychological well-being. So all of these things play a role. And then we also invested that money, you know, into the farm, or invested all that leftover material into pharmaceuticals, which a lot of those have become the very drugs that are treating our metabolic conditions today. And so it's just a super wild hamster wheel that we are on. And so we can, in a short period of time, we took the last couple of generations and really changed how they live on this world and experience this world. We can reverse that, right? It's never too late to become aware and to change things up. And the only way we can really change it is with our almighty dollar, our almighty pocketbook. And so for things like, you know, glyphosate, we're one of the last places on the planet, the United States, that still knowingly applies this into our food systems. Yeah. And the bummer is we put in so much and into disenfranchised, you know, countries around the world that our rainwater is tainted with it. So there's really no such thing as glyphosate-free food, even if it's organic today. So we've changed our soil. We've changed our internal soil. We've made ourselves much more vulnerable. This conversation goes well beyond sugar and well beyond sugar freedom, right? It's so much about, as you noted, it's like, this is about us becoming aware, becoming advocates, and becoming activists for change. And we have to start with ourselves. And any step we take is super helpful. Any awareness you have of what it is that you're putting in, on, and around you is very helpful. And any change, any ripple you make empowers the changes I'm trying to make, the changes you're trying to make, Danny, and changes that other people that are listening here are trying to make in their own lives, in their own families, in their own communities, in their own countries. This is massive, and we're all being called to it because, as people like Dr. Lustig will tell you, we will be extinct. Mother Earth will go on without us. She can do this. Just this week, it's finally, I used to be able to say 1 in 2 men and 1 in 2.4 women will experience cancer in their lifetime. That statistic has changed now to 1 in 2 across the board. So half of us will face this diagnosis. We're even seeing those same statistics with regards to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc. Cancer is now the #1 cause of death, and the World Health Organization says that we will see a doubling of cancer rates globally by 2030. That's just a few years down the road, and it's now 1 in 36 kiddos with autism. How are we not in the streets screaming that we've got to do a heck of a lot more? And it starts at the most fundamental. which is our diet and our lifestyle. We have massive control over that.
Yeah. Yeah. So powerful. What a beautiful way to sort of wrap things up here. I want to keep chatting with you for hours, and we're going to have to get you back on the show because I can tell there's so many more topics that we could definitely get into. I really love and appreciate everything you shared today. I think there's some minds blowing as everybody's listening to this, and there's so much more, as I said, but I've learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nasha, for sharing and coming on. Is there any final pieces that you have to share? And also in that, where can people reach out to you? What's the best way for people to connect with you, your work? I know you've got a couple books and you've got a lot of projects on the go, which is absolutely incredible.
Yes. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being an amplifier of this message in the world. It is so, so needed. I'm incredibly grateful to you for that. So we'll start with that. It gives me goosebumps just to say it. It makes me happy to meet other kindred spirits on a similar path. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Please look for me at mtih.org, which stands for Metabolic Terrain Institute of Health.org. That's where you can learn more about me, see all the different podcasts and other conversations where we're going to post where Danny and I have talked in the future. This is also where you have a little download of your own Terrain 10, so you can explore your own terrain patterns. It also has a link for the Metabolic Approach to Cancer book, as well as my second book, which is co-authored with a group of brilliant physicians called Mistletoe and the Emerging Future of Integrative Oncology. I've also got some contributing in other chapters and textbooks like on low-dose naltrexone, as well as the Noakes Foundation New Nutrition Bible that just came out, this beautiful textbook on carbohydrate restriction lifestyle. I'm very proud of that. I do a little part on that in intermittent fasting. But there's just so many ways to engage with us. We offer trainings for physicians. We offer trainings for patient advocates. We're building the first integrative oncology hospital and research institute on a 1,200-acre regenerative farm, knowing that food is our best medicine. And so, yeah, when you said that we're launching our own podcast, which I'll have to get you on, Danny, in the fall, yes. Metabolic Matters. So this is a really big one coming out. And I'm constantly lecturing to clinicians and researchers all over the world. You'd be surprised at how many standard of care physicians and researchers are coming out of the woodwork knowing that our current model is not working for us. So I'm very honored to be part of a growing mission and vision of many on this planet to change the horrific trajectory that we're facing.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for all of that you're doing and all the things that I know you haven't mentioned. I'll make sure all of Nasha's links are below in the show notes. So come and connect with her, share her information and course with your doctor, with your physician, right? We need to get this. I mean, how amazing is that, right? To be able to actually properly educate, physicians in a different way than they're getting. So I appreciate you doing that. And I know that it's making a difference. I know sometimes I can imagine it feels like it's not, in the big world of like climbing this massive mountain going against, decades of, old ways of thinking and being. So I really just am cheering you on as well from the sidelines. Happy to amplify here on the podcast. And I hope that everybody listening really got a lot out of this. I know they did.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you all. Really grateful.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thanks for being here, everyone. Thank you for tuning in again. And definitely reach out to Dr. Nasha and let me know as well what you loved about this episode. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. If you're loving what we talked about today, please remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone you love. And if you're ready to dive deeper into discovering your root causes and patterns that are keeping you hooked on sugar, be sure to check out our brand new free workshop series that will help you kick emotional eating for good. Find the link to download this free series and other amazing resources in the show notes below.